Is God a complete narcissist? That's what we're talking about today on the channel. In a video a while back, Stephen Woodford over at Rationality Rules argued that God might have some narcissistic tendencies. Let's watch.
The idea of an omnipotent God needing or wanting anything at all doesn't strike me as logically coherent, be it worship from his creation or the need, want, or desire for his creation to achieve salvation. I mean, how pathetic would it be to need worship? We tend to look down on narcissists, and yet when God does it, and in unprecedented proportion, it's somehow a good thing.
In this video, I'm going to break down two ways in which this argument can be understood, and then argue that neither understanding presents a serious challenge to the existence of God.
This is a response to a response that isn't directed at me, but it isn't directed at Cameron either, but rather at Rationality Rules. While Stephen is more than capable of defending himself, this video has been up for a month with no response from Stephen. Most likely he is busy with other projects, doesn't consider it worth his time, or it failed to get noticed. Possibly all three. Could this possibly be Cameron seeking Stephen's attention? Perhaps. A response from me with my mere 5,600 subscribers might be a blow to Cameron's ego. Could Cameron have some of the same issues as his God? Let's see how Cameron defends his narcissistic God. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. Cameron, who captured Christianity years ago and has the motto, "By the way, Christianity is true," not sure why he thinks it's a true-false proposition. Well, sure about that much, doesn't seem at all sure about which version of Christianity is true, as he recently converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. Because, of course, the unchanging truth of God changes as one deciphers more of the encrypted word. Let's see what he has today.
I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Welcome to Capturing Christianity, a channel that is exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief.
Seriously, this is intellectual, but you need to point and say you, like you're talking to a bunch of elementary school kids? This false intellectualism is what got me to switch from Calvinism to Arminianism. The theologians used big words, wrote books you needed a dictionary next to you to read, and they appeared intellectual on the surface. But when you dig in, there's no substance. Will Cameron's talk be more of the same?
All right, so Stephen claims that there's something seriously wrong with a God that requires worship. Now, I think there are at least two ways to interpret this claim. The first way to interpret this claim is pretty straightforward. If God has a need to be worshipped, then there's something wrong with that God. That God has needs. But this is a problem because God is at least supposed to not need anything. A second way to interpret this claim is in terms of commands. If God commands his creatures to worship him, then there's something wrong with that God. That God is like narcissistic or bad in some way. And this is a problem because God can't be narcissistic. God is supposed to be perfectly good by definition. So what I'll do in this video is analyze both of these interpretations of Stephen's argument and argue that neither presents a serious challenge to theism.
And if you aren't convinced, you're just being stubborn, closed-minded, or you just hate God. It never occurs to them that what they say may not be convincing.
So the first thing that we should do, I think, at the outset is define what we mean by worship. And actually, I think that once we do this, once we define what we mean by worship, the problem doesn't necessarily completely go away, but it does lessen quite a bit. So in a recent peer-reviewed paper on the subject, Frederick Chu defines the concept of worship as consisting of two basic components: a mental component, such as gratitude, praise, and reverence, and a ritualistic component like singing songs, gathering together to pray, and reciting scripture.
Chu is a third-year philosophy PhD student at Rutgers. Not sure why you're going there for a definition of worship, but no worries, I'll accept it.
So a key mental component that Chu focuses on is reverence. He points out that although we can praise and express gratitude toward our human parents, we aren't thereby reverencing them or worshiping them, right? So worship is something much deeper than mere praise and gratitude. As Richard Swinburne puts it, quote, worship involves the greatest possible explicit respect, end quote.
But the question is, does this God need this respect and reverence? Why would a tri-omni God need anything at all?
In addition, according to Chu, quote, theists often hold that an agent who is worship worthy must be maximally great, free from imperfections, end quote. Now, I don't know about you, but I do not think that my parents are maximally perfect.
That's just an analogy. But if you want to go with the analogy, do parents need worship or reverence or even respect? No, they don't. I once had some kids placed in a foster home where the foster parents intended to adopt the kids. Each time I visited, the parents were constantly harping on the kids for being disrespectful. The kids were frequently being punished for being disrespectful. Anything they did could be a sign of disrespect. I did my darndest to get these kids away from these foster parents, and I succeeded. They were horrible parents. They were so focused on their own needs for love, respect, and gratitude that they didn't even notice the kids' needs. The kids were fed, clothed, and educated, but their emotional needs were not even touched. Cameron, you haven't addressed the issue at all. Why would a God need this?
Lastly, Chu says that theists often sing songs of love to God. So, to sum up the analysis, quote, worship involves gratitude, praise, being in awe, reverence, taking the worshipped as maximally great, and love, end quote. So, and I think that's actually a pretty good starting point.
Oh, you haven't started the point yet. What was the purpose of the analogy then? To explain the definition? If the definition requires a 2-minute explanation, it isn't a very good definition, is it? Either that or you're right to talk down to your viewers as they are a bunch of 8-year-olds. Was this video made for children? Doesn't look like it.
But so how can worship in this sense be used as an argument against God? So let's go back to the first way that Stephen's argument can be interpreted. If God has a need to be worshiped, then there's something wrong with that God. That God has needs. Now this is a problem because God doesn't need anything. It looks as if this concept of God is logically incoherent. So here's one way that we might turn Stephen's objection into an argument against the existence of God. Premise 1. If God exists, then he has no needs.
I would modify P1 to the Christian God. There are plenty of gods out there that don't claim to be need-free, plenty that don't claim to be omni-gods. But because your God claims to be perfect, being perfect would entail having no needs. After all, if one has needs, one is not perfect. With that caveat, go on.
Premise 2. God has needs. God needs worship. And then 3 just follows logically. God does not exist.
Again, I would modify to this God does not exist. I don't think the argument does or even intends to disprove the existence of all gods, only gods that claim to be perfect. The syllogism is Cameron's, after all.
So this argument is actually logically valid. The question is whether the premises are true. In response, there are at least 2 senses of the term needs that we need to disambiguate in order to properly assess the argument.
Ooh, Cameron used a big word there. Think his audience will understand it?
The first sense of need has to do with survival. So for example, I need water in order to survive. The second sense of need has to do with accomplishing goals. For example, I need ingredients if I intend on cooking dinner. So let's take the first sense first, survival-oriented needs. Does God need worship in order to survive? The answer, it seems to me, is clearly no. God is a metaphysically necessary being. Failing to obtain worship from his creation doesn't mean that he's going to get all weak and then suddenly pop out of existence. God can survive just fine without worship.
Are you sure about that, Cameron? What would happen if no one worshipped your God? What if no one believed in or thought about your God? I personally think he would, in fact, pop out of existence, because he has no existence outside of the minds of believers. Thus, yes, your God needs worship for his very survival. I support that point by looking for any evidence of your God's existence where no one believed in him. And lo and behold, we find none. No culture that was not taught about Christianity from other believers believed in Christianity. Christianity never grew sua sponte. See, I can use big words too. Since your God only exists where people think about him and worship him, I would say he does, in fact, need worship for his survival. I realize that you would then make a look at the trees argument. There are trees. Trees are evidence of God. Therefore, if there are trees, then God is there. And it's true that I can't prove there are no gods in the trees. Come on out, you little druids. Cameron knows you're in there. Neither can you prove that God is in the tree, because your God has no testable qualities that demonstrate his existence. I say his because evidently Jesus has requested that we use his preferred pronouns, so I will respect the wishes of any entity's pronouns, even if it is a needy entity that depends on worship for its survival.
Hence, on the survival-oriented sense of the term needs, premise 2 in the argument is false. God does not need worship in order to survive.
Still not sure about that one, Cameron. I really think your God will just vanish if no one is worshiping him.
Let's now look at the second sense, goal-oriented needs. Does God need worship to accomplish any of his goals? Well, let's assume that one of God's goals is to obtain worship from his creation. If God has a goal of obtaining worship, then God needs worship in order to accomplish that goal.
If, as you claim, God's goal is to obtain worship, we then ask why that would be a goal of a perfect God. You aren't addressing the question, but rather avoiding it. Instead of looking at why a perfect God would need worship, you try to define the problem away by claiming he doesn't need it. He merely wants it as a goal. There is no definition of need that means goal. Your example of needing ingredients if you want to make dinner, the goal is having dinner, not having the ingredients. The need is not the goal. The need, in your example, is obtaining the requirements to fulfill the goal. Can a perfect God have goals? Not to itself. It's already perfect. There is no purpose to attaining a goal, as the purpose of a goal is to attain a desired result or to achieve an ambition. If one is perfect, one can have no ambition. There is nothing to strive for or to become. One has already achieved all that one can achieve as to itself. A perfect God could have goals for humanity, as humanity has not acquired a state of perfection, and the God would be working towards the betterment of humanity. If so, now you need to demonstrate that humanity benefits or moves towards God's desired outcome for it through the act of worship. If worship has such a benefit, is it worship itself that brings about this benefit? If so, then it doesn't matter what the people worship, so long as they engage in worship. To show that a God is achieving a goal by having humans worship him, you need to show some result not just from the worship, but specifically the worship of your God. Since the worship is of no benefit to your God, how can it be? He's already perfect without it. Somehow, this must be for man's benefit. Even if this is God's goal, if achieving this goal is meeting God's needs, we are still at the original problem.
But if that's true, then premise 1 is false. Think about it. Being perfect does not imply that God has no goals. God has lots of goals. Hence, on this goal-oriented sense of the term needs, premise 1 is false.
Except there is no sense in which need means goal. You are merely avoiding the question by attempting to define your way out of it. I note that you have no definition of need, where need really means to have a goal. You attempted to smuggle it in by analogy, but you got caught.
And by the way, if you think that God has no goals, then God has no goal-oriented needs, and hence premise 2 is false.
Now you have just admitted that your definition of need as goal was incorrect. If need and goal were synonymous, there would be no such thing as a goal-oriented need. That would be like saying a goal-oriented goal or a need-oriented need. If God has goal-oriented needs, they are still needs. You still have not addressed the issue. Instead of defending that your God has no needs, you attempt to explain what types of needs your God has, goal-oriented needs. If you could prove that a perfect being can have goal-oriented needs and still be perfect, you would have a point. The entire argument still stands.
Now, you might object that God would still want worship if he were to command worship, just as my commanding my children to stop fighting plausibly implies that I want them to stop fighting. Now, if this is your objection, we need to reformulate the argument. Premise 1 star. If God exists, he has no wants. 2 star. God has wants. He wants worship. 3 star. So God doesn't exist. But the problem now is that while 2 star is true, 1 star is clearly false. Like, it doesn't follow from God's perfection, his existence, or nature that he would have no wants. Nothing about being perfect is incompatible with desiring, say, to create finite persons out of love and wanting to engage in meaningful reciprocal relationships with them.
Now you've made another unsupported claim that a perfect being can have desires. You imply that God desires worship, as Stephen said.
The idea of an omnipotent God wanting or needing children doesn't strike me as logically coherent. But by the same token, the idea of an omnipotent God needing or wanting anything at all doesn't strike me as logically coherent, be it worship from his creation or the need, want, or desire for his creation to achieve salvation. I mean, how pathetic would it be to need worship? We tend to look down on narcissists, and yet when God does it, and in unprecedented proportion, it's somehow a good thing.
Even if God doesn't need, but merely desires worship, why? Does it make him feel good? This implies that God has a need for feeling good. Does it add to his glory, as the Calvinists claim? This implies a need to increase his glory. Demanding humans serve you and worship you is self-serving, which, by the Bible definition of love, is not loving. Yet God claims to be love. It is seeking its own, which the Bible says is not love, and again contradicts God's claim of his own character. Claiming that God doesn't need worship, he simply desires it, doesn't fix the problem. You still end up with a self-centered, narcissistic God. I considered this issue even as a believer and asked my pastor about it. I don't remember what he said, but I do remember that the reply was unsatisfactory. So I chalked it up to one more thing about God that I would never understand until I died, which is like the parent that tells you he gets all the Snickers bars from your trick-or-treat bag just because.
I just got to make sure these are safe. This one's fresh. This one might be poison. That's poison. Poison. That's poison for sure.
Cameron, you fixed nothing. You still have a God with needs or wants that make him out to be a logical contradiction.
In fact, if God didn't want anything, he would be imperfect. A perfect being wouldn't be indifferent to value. Instead, a perfect being would want to promote goods like virtue and to eliminate pointless evils.
Bravo! You have just demonstrated that your God does not exist. Pointless evil does exist in this world. A perfect being would want to eliminate pointless evil. Your God claims to be omnipotent, omniscient, and thus should be able to eliminate pointless evil, yet he does not. Therefore, your God does not exist. Thank you for this perfect demonstration of how your God does not exist because of the problem of evil.
That all being said, isn't there something still wrong with a God that commands worship? Doesn't that make him like egotistical or narcissistic? This takes us to interpretation 2. The second interpretation says that if God commands his creatures to worship him, then God is narcissistic or egotistical. And this is a problem because God can't be narcissistic. God is supposed to be perfectly good by definition.
Thank you for agreeing that being narcissistic is not good.
So for what it's worth, I think this is actually a pretty sensible concern to have. And here's how we might formulate this into an argument against the existence of God. 4, if God exists, he is all good. 5, if God is all good, he does not command any worship. 6, God commands worship. 7, God does not exist. So once again, the argument is logically valid. The question is whether the premises are true. Let's take a look at them one by one. So premise 4 is analytically true. It's true by definition. Most theists should have no problem accepting it. Premise 5 is probably where most of the debate is going to take place. So let's take a closer look at how an atheist might defend it. So one way to defend this premise would be to say that any being that commands worship is morally defective. When someone requests worship from someone else, they do it for bad reasons. And maybe that person is like obsessed with themselves or has self-esteem issues or something else is going on. In short, there are no good reasons to command worship.
That's putting a lot into the atheist argument beyond Stephen's claim.
Elsa? Do you wanna build a straw man?
Stephen never claimed that there are no good reasons to demand worship. He just said that asking for worship is self-centered and narcissistic. I could see reason for a perfect being asking someone to worship someone else for the good of the other one being worshipped, but not for worship of oneself. But go ahead. What possible non-self-serving reason could your God have for demanding worship?
So, one of the things that Chu points out is that what seems to drive the intuition behind premise 5 is that we think the reasons for commanding worship are egotistical. Quote, for example, we might think that when agents command worship, they do so to gain social recognition or because they are excessively concerned over their own good qualities. But what Chu argues is that our reasons for commanding worship might not be God's reasons for commanding worship.
Right. The old God's ways are higher than your ways argument. Doesn't matter. It's still self-serving. Or is the next point that it might not be because of mysterious ways?
God might have non-egotistical reasons for commanding worship. So in the paper, Chu offers two such reasons. First, worship is good for worshipers. And second, worship allows worshipers to have a better relationship with God. So in defense of the first reason, that worship is good for worshipers, Chu argues that there are empirical studies that show that experiencing awe, one of the aspects of worship we noted earlier, has many positive effects, such as promoting humility. According to Chu, quote, experiencing awe is good for the person who experiences awe in many different ways. It gives them positive emotions, helps keep them humble, and helps them to become a better moral agent by making them more inclined to pro-social behaviors, end quote.
So it doesn't matter what you worship, provided you worship something. We need not worship to get this benefit. One can be in awe of a mountain or an ocean without worshiping them. If the purpose is to bring about a sense of awe, God would be better off sending believers out into the world to experience the awe-inspiring, rather than containing them in a building with a bland preacher. If the goal is awe, I can think of far more awe-inspiring experiences than sitting through a worship service.
Important to note here as well is that the positive effects of experiencing awe persist well after the experience has ended. Now, in defense of the second reason,
Wait, you aren't even going to address the aspect of there being no need to worship God to achieve this goal? Have you seriously not experienced anything awe-inspiring in your life, Cameron, that wasn't worship of your God? I imagine that you have, and you just didn't think this one through.
the second reason that worship allows worshipers to have a better relationship with God, Chu argues that when we fail to take time to reflect on the good qualities of those that we love, we tend to take them for granted, and our relationship suffers as a result.
And now you have backed into the divine hiddenness problem. If relationships suffer as a result of not thinking on the good qualities of the other person in the relationship, when has God ever done that? When has God ever said what great qualities humans have? Does God need to worship humans so that he can have a relationship with them? Because relationships go both ways. If humans need to interact with God to keep up the relationship, then God needs to interact with humans to keep up the relationship. But he doesn't. No one has seen your God in the last 2 millennia. I know there are some people who claim to have seen Jesus, but none have been verified. And even if a couple were, that still doesn't explain why God isn't appearing to everyone as he's supposed to love and want a relationship with everyone, except for the Calvinists. They say he only wants a relationship with and loves the chosen. What's more, if this really is good for relationships, why do we never see relationship advice on worshiping your mate or your children? I'll tell you why. Because it isn't. This is not how to build a good relationship.
And this is part of the reason why we actively set time aside to celebrate people that we love. By focusing on the other person, it draws both of us closer together. And that's actually what worship does.
Celebrate them, yes. Worship them, no.
It forces the worshiper to focus on God's goodness and helps them appreciate God at a much deeper level, bringing both parties closer together.
If that were true, then it wouldn't be worship. It would just be together time. You know who never shows up to participate in worship together time? God. You sing to God, tell God how great He is, read His book to each other, talk about God. But the God does nothing to add to the experience. It's almost as if you worship something that isn't even there.
Moreover, consider the following quote from C.S. Lewis.
I think we delight to praise what we enjoy, because the praise not merely expresses but completes the enjoyment. It is its appointed consummation. It is not out of compliment that lovers keep on telling one another how beautiful they are. The delight is incomplete till it is expressed. It is frustrating to have discovered a new author and not to be able to tell anyone how good he is. To come suddenly, at the turn of the road, upon some mountain valley of unexpected grandeur, and then to have to keep silent, because the people with you care for it no more than for a tin can in the ditch.
And again, they say it to each other. What's more, one partner in the relationship isn't asking the other partner to worship him or her. The mountain doesn't ask you to worship it. What you aren't getting, Cameron, isn't that admiring something or someone is bad, but telling someone to tell you how great they are is. Even if it is good for the humans, which I don't think is true, asking them to worship you instead of allowing it to come freely is self-serving and narcissistic.
So Lewis is saying here that praising what one enjoys actually brings more enjoyment. And it seems plausible that this applies in the case of God. If you really sit down and think about it, it just seems so appropriate or fitting for us to revere God, given that A, we depend on Him every moment of our existence, B, every good that we have is ultimately thanks to God, and then C, God is perfect.
And again, you have dodged the question. Is it not self-serving for a perfect God to want this? Is it not incoherent for a perfect God to need this? Your response that it's good for humans addresses neither of those questions.
Like, we rightly praise our parents if they're morally good, precisely because we partly owe our existence to them. So how much more fitting, then, that we praise a morally perfect God to a much richer extent, without whose continual gift of life we would literally cease to exist. So for these reasons, it's not so clear that God could only have bad or egotistical reasons for commanding others to worship Him.
My dad frequently asked me to praise him for what a great dad he was, except he wasn't. He was mediocre at best. His asking me to tell him what a great dad he is didn't draw us closer. It pulled us apart. It created resentment in me that he felt I owed him this, as if I asked him to bring me into this world, and he had done me some favor by doing it. It also caused me to focus on the things that he had done wrong. By asking me to tell him what a great dad he was, it brought to my mind the times that he wasn't, not the times that he was. I would indulge him and stroke his ego as he so desperately wanted, but this sure didn't help our relationship. If you want to love, sing songs to, dance around for your God, then go right ahead. But when your God tells you you have to do that, it's no longer an act of praise. I question if it's even worship anymore. If it's done by obligation, it sure isn't an expression of love. Your new church there, Cameron, has just that, holy days of obligation, where you are required to go to worship, whether you want to or not. If this is commanded as a duty on your part, it isn't the act of love that you so desperately want it to be. And while some would go there to worship, whether they were commanded to or not, it doesn't change that your God asks for worship. I am aware of no healthy relationship where one partner asks the other to worship him.
Hence, it's not clear that premise 5 in the argument we've been discussing is true. Arguably, it's false.
Granted, any statement is arguably false. Whether or not a good argument can be made for it is another story. I didn't care for the way you worded it in the first place. It should have read, if God is all good, he would not command worship of himself. I could see an all good being commanding worship of something else for the benefit of another, but commanding self-worship is an act of narcissism. It is self-serving. So while you have made a case for praising people and things that you are in awe of, you have not made a case for why it is not self-serving to ask others to worship you. Point 5, as corrected, still stands.
Hence, neither interpretation of Stephen's original objection to theism seems insurmountable.
Seems insurmountable to me. And in case you are wondering why Cameron didn't use any of Stephen's video other than the short clip in the intro, it's because it was a minor point in Stephen's video, the purpose of which was to support Christianity over Islam. That's right, the video that Cameron is responding to supported Christianity, other than for this one small point. Stephen could have given a more detailed argument for his position, but as he stated in the video,
I'm tempted to expand upon this concern in detail, but since Kanj merely treaded lightly on this territory, I'll do the same.
Yet Cameron makes it out that this is all Stephen had on the point. Now that Cameron has called Stephen's point into question, possibly he will respond with something more robust. If not, it matters not. Cameron hasn't even made a dent in what Stephen put out, while treading it lightly. Is Cameron's God narcissistic? According to the Mayo Clinic, narcissistic personality disorder is a mental health condition in which people have an unreasonably high sense of their own importance. They need and seek too much attention and want people to admire them. People with this disorder lack the ability to understand or care about the feelings of others. Behind the mask of extreme confidence, they are not sure of their self-worth and are easily upset by the slightest criticism. Let's see. The Bible says God thinks of himself as being omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. He thinks of himself as being holy and perfect. Seems to fit the bill to me. Definitely seeks to get people to admire him. Can't stand criticism. Instead, he says no one is to question him. He is easily upset. He kills people for admiring other gods. Even says the punishment for that offense goes on to the offender's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. A single lie is enough to put you on the naughty list, despite him giving humans a nature that cannot do otherwise. He gives humans a sex drive and then punishes them for having it. He claims to give humans a choice to love him or not, but then punishes them if they make that choice. I'd say your God fits the bill in every respect. The believer would say it doesn't matter because it's true. In one respect, they are right. Since their God isn't real, their God is whatever they believe it to be. Thus, if it's perfect in their minds, then it's perfect. But if their God is the Bible God, not whatever God they made up for themselves, he is not perfect. He's morally inferior, a poor communicator, completely dependent on humans to do everything for him, a chronic liar, impulsive, and lacks problem-solving skills. Cameron, there are therapists that might be able to help your God out if he would just show up for the appointment. Live your life. This week, a fresh hot chocolate chip granny cookie goes to Badger 1296. Thank you, Badger.